Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and that invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. This episode concludes our conversation with Anita Yudkin-Suliveres, professor in the Department of Educational Foundations, Faculty of Education, and coordinator of the UNESCO Chair on Education for Peace at the University of Puerto Rico. Anita discusses her work with other scholars in human rights and peace education in Central and South America, the relationship of social justice pedagogy to human rights education, how human rights education can address the threats posed by anti-democratic forms of governance around the globe, role models who have influenced her work, and changes she would recommend to advance human rights education in the future. I think that's important because you're talking about creating an activist culture.
Oh, yeah.
To actually apply what they're doing in the class outside. And the same thing, and I think as you have done it, you have exemplified that yourself. But the other thing I'd like you to talk about, sort of coming out of that, is your relationship with other scholars in Latin America and the Caribbean, which from what I have read, is very important in how it sort of stimulates you, but also you share things with them. Can you talk about those sharings?
Sure. This all started in the Amnesty Project, Teaching for Freedom. I first met wonderful people like our mutual friend, Abraham Magenzo, through the Amnesty Project when the Teaching for Freedom Project had a center, a pedagogical center at the Institute for Human Rights in Costa Rica. And we would join there and learn and develop materials and ways of thinking about educating on human rights, which started with colleagues, as I mentioned, like Abraham many years ago. Then through Abraham and other scholars in the Spanish-speaking world, because it includes many colleagues from Spain and Latin America, we, I think, realized, this is my analysis, but I think we realized that in terms of human rights education, the way of thinking about human rights education in Latin America and the way it responded to particular issues that were very important regarding human rights in Latin America was quite different from what was happening, for example, in Europe and in the United States. And we almost organically started before there was all these ways of sharing that we now have, with internet and social media and emails and all that. Before that, we started sharing materials and would send literally by mail, like publications or articles. And that, of course, grew when we started having many more ways of communicating and knowledge sharing, and through the UNESCO chairs, because many, not all, but many colleagues that were in human rights education in Latin America at one point or another began related to UNESCO chairs that were working on this topic. So we have had attempts to establish networks and have shared many activities, from inviting scholars to the University of Puerto Rico for conferences, teacher training, and having us go over to Chile and Argentina, Mexico, to work with teachers or work at universities for short periods of time for congresses or conferences or workshops. And it has been ongoing, and we have really learned a lot from one another. And something I wanted to mention is that sometimes, because I've had the good fortune of also going to many events in Spain, in Europe, because of the UNESCO chair, and also, I would say, the global north. And sometimes I'm sitting like at a conference or something, and I say, there is not a true dialogue in terms of knowledge between the global north and the global south. There's different epistemologies, there's different ways of being, of understanding, and sometimes they overlap, but people on the global south do not really know much of what's going on in the global north, and people in the global north don't know much, especially with the language issue. Okay, like for example, I was reading a wonderful book on peace education and human rights education. And when I'm reading literature review about in this book, it says, well, these are the main authors. And then I'm like, yeah, in the English speaking world. Yes, but this is not everybody. This is not everything. There are other languages and other ways of understanding what's happening. And that's something, colleagues like Eduardo Sandoval from Mexico, he does wonderful work on peace education from an indigenous perspective and understanding other ways of knowing, that I think is part of what those who are now working in the field of decolonial studies and so on address. But that bridge between people in sociology and those kinds of ways of developing theory in academia, well, they don't really deal much with education. And then those of us in education have to appropriate that knowledge, but from both. I don't want to sound like it's just bipolar, because it's not, but there's many ways of understanding how peace can be constructed and how we can educate for peace in different contexts, even within one country, but also worldwide. And that's like the main thing I've learned through all these years working with these wonderful colleagues that, they really are. And we're good friends, and we support each other, and we send big hugs and kisses and everything when, we're having big problems, because we're in it together. And we've learned a lot from one another and continue to do so.
So if you have those connections in Latin America and the Caribbean, have, in my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, they tend to focus on a more popular education emphasis in Latin America.
Well, in its origins, yes. Human rights education in Latin America comes from a popular education base, but over the years, it has changed, because human rights education has officially been incorporated in many countries' educational systems or plans of action, and it has moved to more formal education. But I think what's still there at the heart of it is critical education, critical pedagogy as a partner of human rights education. That's much more prominent in Latin America than maybe in other places. Although, of course, there's many critical peace education scholars worldwide. But I think at the root of human rights education in the past decades in Latin America, that has always been at the root. So it has been a very important part of human rights education, which is a lot more developed in Latin America than peace education, definitely.
Hmm.
Oh,
It's
definitely.
interesting because you're
Yeah.
talking really about Freirean concepts,
Yes.
dialogue in the community, people understanding human dignity from the ground up, not from the top down.
Definitely.
And it's interesting you mentioned that also because I want to pose a hypothetical and then see how you would respond. In the United States, there's been a big dialogue about the relationship between human rights, education, and social justice. You can look at the George Floyd murder and the subsequent movements and so forth. But let's put it in Puerto Rico. How would you take your focus on critical educational theory like that of Freire and address, let's say, the housing problem in Puerto Rico as a human rights issue?
Oh, okay. Well, we need to be able to pose critical questions about issues like housing and education and health and general well-being that have to do with human rights. We need to, have a problem posing education, but we also, which is also very Freirean, but we also need to create the spaces or ways of inquiry that allow for those questions to come up from students. I mean, I can pose the question, but maybe that's not what's going to click. Or I can start with that, but I need to work with students in a way that questions come up and they will ask those questions, even if they're unsure how to even phrase the question. But this is something that's like, wait a minute, is this related to this or not, or so on. So I think just bringing in a picture, a short video, a newspaper or something, or social media, a report, whatever, that has to do, for example, with housing, or has, in my peace education class, that happens all the time. When we talk about human rights, when we talk about children's rights, well, okay, here's an issue. What's going on here? And if we can contrast that issue with a similar issue globally, it allows you to maybe have a broader way of looking at a local problem that allows you to think of it in a bigger term. Right now, I'm thinking, for example, of an image that Sebastián Salgado, he's a photographer, and he has this image of a big tube, like a duct, an oil duct or something. I don't know what's inside the tube, that goes through this slum area in India. And, you have all these houses that are falling apart. And then you have this major thing right through that community or village. It's in a city, and it's going through it, and there's even people walking over it to get somewhere else. Well, that's such a strong image about what you mean by, for example, development. Okay, is this real development because you've been able to take, I don't know, water, gas, whatever it's in the tube, to the bigger part of the city? And then bring in a picture or an issue that has to do with a similar development, for example, with the use of energy in Puerto Rico. So we have to be able to provoke that they broaden their ways of looking at things and problematizing, if there's such a word in English, converting them into a problem, not to be solved, but to be understood, to be thought about, to be questioned. And that happens with many topics, with many topics. The housing issue. No, well, I also invite very good colleagues to come to class, because if my students, for example, are very interested in something like the housing issue, which I know something about it, like as an educated person or a person that's interested in social issues, but I don't know much about it. And so I'll find somebody from a local organization that's dealing with that. And I have them come to class or maybe visit virtually, now that we've, engaged in this new world of being able to be together. So, and it depends a lot on what students identify as key issues of concern in the peace education class.
So you would say it's really an issues-based approach.
It's an issues-based approach, but it's also an emerging issues-based approach, because, in education, and it happens even more with the virtual world and online courses, they say, okay, this week one topic, and you cannot digress, or everybody has to do this assignment by a certain day. I can't deal with that. Okay. And I say, okay, this is our schedule. These are our topics. But from day one, I ask the students, of all this that's in here, what's of most interest to you? And we might spend a lot more time on one topic than another, and it doesn't flow in an equal basis with a perfectly scheduled timing. So fortunately, at this stage, I can do stuff like that. Nobody's going to question me, but I think it's hard for teachers and even beginning university professors to be able to have the freedom of timing and selection of what students really are interested on working. It's not that I'm going to forget about what it is they're supposed to learn, but how do you work it out so that it's focused on issues, but it's also allows for questions to emerge and things to develop in another direction than,
So you're being responsive. You're being responsive to the
yes,
students.
but you have to. How are you going to educate on human rights and not be? I mean, it has to be. It has to be.
So taking on that idea, and given the fact that the global scene right now is rather volatile, that's a sort of a shorthand way to put it. Where would you see your ideas or others' ideas about human rights education going in the future? Do you believe there's a certain path or trend that you believe is underway or should happen?
Well, recently I've been collaborating with some colleagues in Puerto Rico and abroad that have to do with where do we go, from here? How do we deal with global issues like global warming, like the increase of ways of manifestations of violence, of authoritarianism? I can't even say it. How do we work with a harder world and also a fastly changing world, not necessarily for good? So we've been working on that, and I wrote a chapter for a book. It's in Spanish, but it's called Pactos Ecosociales de Puerto Rico. And I also wrote an article for a special issue of a peace education journal that's called Revista Copala, comes out of Mexico. And they're looking at a new declaration for a culture of peace. And in both experiences, I wrote about, 5 or 6 key principles or guidelines or themes that, even if you want to use the educational word, competencies, have to go in the work we do for peace education based on human rights. And one of those is, well, critical thinking and creative thinking. And we have to really work hard on ways of understanding reality, but also being able to propose things around what's happening. The other is, and I mentioned this throughout our talk, the awareness of the relationship between global and local problems. New ways of doing, and this has more to do with academia, but new ways of doing research, new ways of recognizing, ways of knowing, or what in Spanish we call saberes. There's so many saberes that, we don't necessarily recognize in academia that we have to. Also, the social emotional learning. I mean, I know this has been going on for a long time, but increasingly, it has to do with being able to face the difficult times we're living in, but also be solid. Do it in a way that you develop empathy and solidarity. I mean, not just learn social emotional skills that have to do with inner strength or managing your emotions. I mean, all of that is important. I mean, that's my original field, and that's what I work in, educational psychology. But we have to move beyond that. It's social emotional learning for the common good. So that has to be part of what we do. And of course, I mean, and this for human rights education, I think has always been there, at least in my experience coming from the Amnesty Project, has to do with the importance of the arts and learning ways of expressing through the arts, even if you're not and don't consider yourself an artist. There's so many ways nowadays that you can express your ideas, your ways of understanding, your beliefs, your many ways of even solving a problem, and how can you express what that could be. And finally, you need spaces for real participation in schools and in organizations, because you have to be able to be there and make decisions with others. And that happens can happen from a very young age in different scenarios. And you mentioned at the beginning or a while ago about collaboration, and it has to be there even in the schools with local community projects and so on, in order to move from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the understanding of human rights in paper to understanding that you have to live human rights in the educational practice and beyond the school. Not that we're able to do it all the time with everybody, but we have to plan to get that done through our human rights and peace education efforts.
I think those 6 principles are very well founded, and that's the type of thing which I believe often educators need more, not less, because you can get sort of down to the minute, the specificity, but if you can't connect it to a global concept or a global guideline, it's hard to make sense out of all these small things, right?
I want to mention an initiative from the UNESCO chair that I have in mind when we started the talk, and realized I didn't mention it, because it has to do with all of this that we are just mentioning. A couple of years ago, well, actually quite a few years ago, we said, oh, you know what? We need to recognize the work that teachers are doing to promote human rights, to promote peace, to promote conflict resolution, different topics that have to do with peace building in schools, because we hear all these terrible news all the time. It's here, forget it. It's like, I don't know how many, 10,000 students just now, last week, 10,000 students. Puerto Rico is, as I mentioned, the population is decreasing. We have 3 million from 4 million that we had 10 years ago, and even a little less than 3 million. 10,000 students in the public system failed their grades last year. Well, that's a lot of students that have failed. And news like that, and it's true. It's not that that's not happening, and I do not wish to deny. We need to understand that we have a very serious problem, like that one, for example. But there's also some very good things that are happening, and teachers need to learn from one another, and they're very isolated. So we started recognizing what we call best practices towards a culture of peace from teachers. And first, it was by invitation. We asked some teachers that we knew from the university lab schools or university high school. We said, oh, this is so good. We want people to know it. So we documented it and so on. And then we've been doing open calls for teachers to submit their work. And what started with 2, 3, then it was up to 8 or 9 good practices that we had documented. This in February, we published 6 more, and we thought, oh, this is, wow, what a big jump. We have these 6 other wonderful good practices. And we opened the new call in February, and our dear colleague and friend, Alicia Cabezudo, who's a peace educator from Argentina, who is now living in Colombia. She said, because we were transmitting this by internet, and a couple of colleagues like her, they said, oh, you have to open this up. It can't be just for educators in Puerto Rico, for educators in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we said, okay, let's go for it. Well, the good news, but we are like, whoa, because now we have to be able to work with all of these proposals. The good news is we got 42 new proposals from our call for teachers' works to be recognized in February. We got 42 new proposals, 24 from Colombia. I think it's 15 or 16 from Puerto Rico, and then 1 here and there from other countries. And it's a beautiful project. We've been reading through those 42 proposals that we got, and we hope next semester we will have probably 30 of those published as best practices of culture of peace. And they're really inspiring when you look at them. And we also work with those teachers in being able, and they're also university professors amongst those who have proposed best practices. And there's actually, I think at the present time, 2 of the ones that are already published in our webpage are from university professors. But we work with them because we say, okay, some people write very little and some people write a lot. And we're like, no. Okay, how do we put this in 5 or 6 pages so somebody can understand what you've been doing? So it's, in a way, a research and documentation experience to put them together. So right now we're working on that, and hopefully we'll get some funds that we're trying to get approved so we can put some more time into those best practices and make them available in various formats. But just having that response was, in a way, as I said, inspiring, but also challenging, because first of all, there's work to be done to get this out there so people know them, but also you begin to wonder, there's so much that we can learn from one another, and there's very little ways of doing it. So we hope that this time we will have a much bigger number of good practices to share.
Well, it sounds like that's
we're excited about it.
It's a great example of praxis, theory and practice being brought together. So let's turn to our last few questions. And I ask these same questions of every person on the podcast. So who would be the most influential role model for your work, living or deceased?
Well, in a grand scale, Paolo Freire, but in our peace education, human rights education world, Abraham Mayenzo, that I've mentioned before, from Chile, Betty Reardon from the US. She's a wonderful peace educator. Jesus Jares from Spain, who's also deceased. his work on peace education and human rights education from a critical perspective and with on-hands experience in schools, to me, is marvelous. But to my knowledge, it's just available in Spanish. And my friend Alicia Cabezudo that I just mentioned from Argentina, who's also a peace educator. There's 4 people. Jesus Harris, I never worked with personally, although he was going to come to Puerto Rico before he got very ill. But the rest I've worked with in different ways, and it's been my pleasure being in this ride with them.
Okay, so let's move on then to what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
I chose a quote from Betty Reardon because I thought it was good for this topic that we've been talking about in this interview. And I haven't used it before, but it came to mind. And it says, human rights puts flesh on the bones of the abstraction of peace and provide the details of how to bring the flesh to life. Peace is very abstract for many people. And human rights is a way of making peace understandable and doable. And that's why I like that quote from Betty so much. And that's from a conference she gave at the University of Puerto Rico, which is the only one we have in English, and it's published in our webpage.
Okay. And so the last question, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education, what would you do?
Give teachers the freedom to learn and the freedom to teach for equity, for justice, and empowerment based on human rights. That's a big one. But that's what I would wish for.
So just to let me clarify something, you would want that to be at the core of things like curriculum standards and the core of educational philosophies for agencies that control education, correct?
I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but yeah. If you trust teachers and if you allow them to learn and you help them with the tools they might not have regarding human rights, let them go, let them run with this. Let them decide what they want to learn and pursue and do it with their students. But in our increasingly controlled education world, that's almost like utopia. But that's what I would wish for, yes.
Less bureaucratization and more academic freedom and giving responsibility to people to make thoughtful decisions.
Yeah. And also give them the tools where they can find things that they want to learn about human rights. Because, yeah. Last semester, I had an online course for teachers at the University of Puerto Rico, experienced teachers. And I mean, their questions are just marvelous. And they had such good ideas, but they had never had the time to think about how these ideas, first of all, had to do with human rights or had to do with the subjects that they teach and how they could come about becoming. Even though I'm an English teacher, I'm also a human rights teacher and a peace education teacher, or I'm a math teacher, or I'm the social studies teacher, or I'm the school counselor. I had a counselor and a social worker in the group. Oh, the social worker just flew with it. She's like, oh, yes, I can do this because she has more freedom than teachers in the way she works with students. They come to her and they're for her to work with. And so she had a lot more ways of thinking immediately about what she would do as a human rights and peace educator while being a social worker.
Well, Anita, I must say that I think what you've done today is inspire me, and I think you'll inspire the audience with the ideas you've been sharing. So I wanted to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
It's my pleasure.
And look forward to being in contact with you. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, Pocket Cast, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at HREUSA.org. That's KRISTI at HREUSA.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.